Well, welcome folks here in our sanctuary. Welcome folks visiting with us online. And welcome to the resumption of our look at C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity. It's been about a month since last we met. And we're about halfway through the book. So that we had 5 weeks, then we took about a month break because it seemed like in March especially we had something every Wednesday special, whether it was Feed My Starving Children or Holy Week events, or we just had a lot that kind of interrupted that we decided to just take the month break and then resume now. So anybody who's having to pull it back up, because it has been a month since last we met, the book Mere Christianity, just as a refresher to all of us, C.S. Lewis, Oxford professor who became a Christian in midlife, was a devoted atheist for much of his young life, fought in World War I, came out of that and was, of course, British. In the interim between World War I and World War II, he found faith, became a Christian. He was a professor of literature at Oxford. And that explains the Narnia Chronicles, his most famous work probably to the general public, the 7 books that make up the Narnia series that have been made into movies and other media. And they're wonderful books, and I've read them all a couple of times. But I'm most interested in his books of theology that were geared to the common person, not geared at fellow, at theologians or seminary type folk, geared at the normal, everyday Christian. And as we said, this book was actually started as a series of radio addresses given on the BBC during World War II. The BBC, and it almost seems like things like this would never happen today, the BBC asked him to do a series of addresses to explain to the general population of Great Britain what is Christianity. And that's why it's called Mere Christianity. Mere, not like it's somehow unimportant, but mere as in basic or fundamental, or Mere Christianity as in it's not Roman Catholic Christianity, it's not Methodist Christianity, it's not Lutheran Christianity, it's not Pentecostal Christianity, it's not Eastern Orthodox Christianity, etc. It's not a particular brand of Christianity, and he makes a point to say he's not trying to be any particular denomination, even though he himself was a part of the Church of England, what we would call the Episcopal Church or the Anglican Church. He sent his notes to a priest, a Methodist, and I can't remember the third person he sent them to make sure he wasn't being overly on one side or other of mere, basic, fundamental Orthodox Christianity. And so he gave these series of radio addresses to the British public, and then after the war is when he turned the radio addresses into this book. And he changed it up slightly since the radio addresses were written for the ear, and this is more written for the eye. But it's essentially the same thing that he gave in those radio addresses, explaining to the population of Great Britain what is Christianity. And if you remember, he starts in a way, the first part is probably the most challenging. As we started together, it was maybe because he's kind of making a case for why we should believe there is a God. And he doesn't start like some people start that argument. Some people start more from look at the creation, and if there's a creation, there must be a creator. He doesn't really start there, although that's something that comes in. He starts by saying there is something in the human nature that is from the outside, and that thing that we humans have from a very young age is a sense of right and wrong, a sense of fair and unfair. That even a child will say very early on, that's not fair, that's not right. And he says, where does that come from? And his argument is that it is in the very design of the human being, because we are designed by a creator who is the author of right and wrong. That's where he starts, and that is probably I'd say the most challenging part of the book in some ways, because his starting point. Then he gets to maybe the part that's a little easier to read and a little more familiar to us, which is what do Christians believe? And he talks about, the concepts that people have of God, and why some of them are really rather silly. Some of them don't make a lot of sense, and he tries to say this is what Christians believe about the nature of God, and the nature of humanity. And as an Orthodox believer, he talks about the fact that we humans are made as eternal beings. We are made in the image of God, made for eternity, but also broken and prone to disobedience and sin. And so he talks about that essential nature of the human being on the one hand, made in the very image of our Creator, meant for eternity, but also prone to disobedience, prone to sin. And that was book 2, sort of. Book 3 is where he gets down to more detail about Christianity, and that's where the more recent part. And if you have this particular copy that we made available here, or even if you don't, if you have a table of contents, he kind of goes through in book 3 Christian behavior. He goes through morality and marriage and sexuality and things like that. And that's where we were in the middle of when we paused. And we had just done the last chapter we did before the break was on forgiveness. And maybe the kind of the humorous part of that is in an earlier chapter he talked about the Christian viewpoint of sex, and how those who are outside the church would find it uncomfortable and restrictive, and God doesn't believe in anybody having any fun, and how it seems very almost prudish to the outsider. He talks about how that would be a very unpopular part of Christian doctrine, is its view of sexuality as being there's a moral. It's not simply recreational. It's not that we are beasts. It is a covenant created by God, sexuality. And he talks about that being unpopular. But then when he gets to the chapter on forgiveness, he says, this is even more unpopular. He says, the chapter on forgiveness, he says, the Christian doctrine of forgiving people who have wronged you, of love for your enemy, of forgiving someone over and over is much harder, he says, even than the teachings on sexuality or marriage or things like that. He said forgiveness is very unpopular because it goes against a lot of what our natural inclination is, to take revenge, to get back at people, to hold grudges. And he talks a lot about the difficulty of what it really means to forgive. And he kind of ends by saying forgiveness is not about saying that people shouldn't be punished for wrongdoing. He says you can perfectly believe in Christian forgiveness and still believe that people who do wrong should be incarcerated, or even he supports the death penalty. He says that justice is not counter to the idea of forgiveness. Forgiveness is always about wishing the best for someone, but it's not about saying, well, what he did was okay. No, it's not about excusing sin. It's not about saying, well, it's fine or it's okay. Often it's not okay. He says forgiveness is a choice. It is a choice to forgive. And that's kind of where we ended up. And he talked about, one of the central parts is just how forgiveness is in this overall context of we are created for eternity. That this life is not the only life that there is. So he comes out for justice, but he also says forgiveness is part of what it means to follow Jesus. And he talks about looking inwardly as well and realizing we are very flawed as well, and we tend to excuse our own flaws and focus on someone else's flaws. So that's probably enough talking about where we have been. We picked up, or we will pick up on page 121 if you have this This version, if you don't, it's the chapter entitled "The Great Sin," number 8 in that section, the great sin. And his opening sentence there, it tells you right off the bat that we're going to get more into a Christian worldview as opposed to just a general morality or a general way of thinking about morals. The opening sentence there on 121, I now come to that part of Christian morals where they differ most sharply from other morals. And he talks about there as one vice in this world that everyone is guilty of, but that everyone hates in other people. And that is pride. He says there, the second says, there's one vice of which no man in the world is free, which everyone in the world loathes when he sees it in someone else, and of which hardly any people, except Christians, ever imagine that they are guilty themselves. I've heard people admit that they're bad-tempered, or that they cannot keep their heads about girls or drink, or even that they're cowards. I don't think I've ever heard anyone who was not a Christian accuse himself of this vice. At the same time, I have very seldom met anyone who was not a Christian who showed the slightest mercy to it in others. There's no fault which makes a man more unpopular, no fault which we are more unconscious of in ourselves. And the more we have it in ourselves, the more we dislike it in others. And he says, and that is pride. Pride. Also sometimes he says called self-conceit. He says pride is the basis, really, of every other sin. And pride is something that we all deal with internally, that we all are guilty of, and the thing that we hate when we see it in other people. And he's going to say all through this, the more you think you're not guilty of it, the more likely are that you are very guilty of it. Anyone who thinks, well, I'm not pride at all, I'm not guilty of pride, he says that person is probably the person who is the most prideful. And he says at the bottom of 121, according to Christian teachers, the essential vice, the utmost evil, is pride. He mentions other sins. Unchastity, anger, greed, drunkenness are mere flea bites in comparison. That's how bad pride is. He says, it was through pride that the devil became the devil. It leads to every other vice. It is the complete anti-God state of mind. And if you remember, at least in the scriptures, it talks about Lucifer, which means Lucifer actually means light. Lucifer, the idea being that an angel of light was not willing to serve in heaven, was not willing to take the second place, was not willing to be under God, and there was therefore rebellion, but that it was pride that brought about the fall of Lucifer. And that's why, at least in popular understanding, when we talk about Satan, Lucifer, the devil, or even demons, it is the idea that what is the essential quality there? It is pride. It is the unwillingness to submit to the authority of God. And, if you think about even the beginnings of the Genesis story, when the serpent, and you've heard me say, and Lewis would say the same thing, that the Genesis stories are more parables than they are science. But in that story, the serpent, which represents the voice of evil, the voice of Satan, however you want to understand the serpent there, appeals to pride in the first couple. Has God really said you're not allowed to eat any of this fruit? Oh, no. We just can't eat that one. Oh, well, that's because God doesn't want you to know what he knows. God doesn't want you to be able to be judge what he can judge. It's all appealing to, you can be just as good as God. You don't have to be under him anymore. You can be equal to him. You can eat that fruit and you'll be a God. You'll be like God. It's this appeal to pride that is the downfall of the fall in the Genesis story. And it says there in that first full paragraph of 122, if you want to find out how proud you are, the easiest way is to ask yourself, how much do I dislike it when other people snub me or refuse to take notice of me or shove their oar in? That's a British expression that, again, has to do with upstaging you. Or patronize me or show off. The point is that each person's pride is in competition with everyone else's pride. It's because I wanted to be the big noise at the party that I'm so annoyed at someone else being the big noise. So when someone else is being extra prideful and it really gets your goat, he's saying that shows just how much full of pride you are. That someone else exhibiting that is such an irritant to you. Because he's going to make the point that what pride is really about is essentially, he says it's essentially competitive. That pride is essentially competitive. Pride is not about, I want to be rich. It's about, I want to be richer than him. It doesn't matter how much money or success or power or prestige or fame, it's all about having more of it than this guy or this gal. Pride is essentially a competitive thing. He says that pride, this is about 2/3 of the way down on 122, pride gets no pleasure out of having something, only out of having more of it than the next man. Pride is about having more than the next guy. We say that people are proud of being rich or clever or good looking, but they're not. They're proud of being richer or cleverer or better looking than others. He's saying if everybody were equally wealthy and equally good looking and equally, there would be nothing to be proud about. It's always about competition. It is essentially, he says, competitive in a way that the other sins or vices are not. He talks about something like sexual impulse. He says that's not about, the sexual impulse is not competitive. He says unless it's like two men going after the same woman or something like that. But then he says at the top of 123, a proud man will take your girl from you, not because he wants her, but just to prove to himself that he's a better man than you. Pride is always competitive. It's always then about power. It's always about power. Pride is about power, control. And he says at the end of that paragraph, all the evils in the world which people put down to greed or selfishness are really the result of pride. And he goes all in on this. And of course, you can tell this was written in the 1940s because his example is one that we like, wait a minute, because he says, what makes a man who makes 10,000 pounds a year anxious to get 20,000 pounds a year? And we go, well, if we know the exchange rate, 10,000 pounds a year is not that much money in 2026. But in 1946, that would be like saying $1 million. He says, what's the point of a man with $1 million wanting to have $2 million? He says it's not about pleasure. Fill in the number that you could buy anything you basically want. Whatever luxury, whatever, trips, big house, nice car, whatever. Fill in the number there. He says it's not about even that. Reaches a limit where you don't need any more money to get what you really want. He says it's about having more money than that guy. It's about being richer than that guy. It's all about a wish for power and control. He says, power, this is the middle of that page, power is what pride really enjoys. There's nothing that makes a man feel so superior to others than be able to move them around like toy soldiers. He says, what is it that makes a political leader or a whole nation go on and on demanding more and more? Pride again. If I am a proud man, as long as there's one man in the whole world more powerful or richer or cleverer than I, he is my rival and my enemy. Now, sadly, some areas probably are more prone to that than others. At least my mind immediately goes to politics, and this is not a partisan thing. And it's Republican or Democrat, I think equally fall into this trap that it is all about having more power than the next guy. It's all about having more control than the next guy. It's all about being more popular than the next guy. It's always about power. Pride is about power. And so he says in Christianity, this is the underlying cause of sin. And then he takes that away from how we relate to each other, this idea that pride is always about, I've got to be better than this guy. I got to get more attention than this guy. I've got to get more money than this guy. I've got to whatever. He says, now how does that relate to how we see God, or how do we relate to God? That first full paragraph on 124. In God, you come up against something which is in every way immeasurably superior to yourself. Unless you know God as that, and therefore know yourself as nothing in comparison, you do not know God at all. As long as you're proud, you cannot know God. A proud man is always looking down on things and down on people. And of course, as long as you're looking down, you can't see something that's above you. As long as you're looking down, you can't see the one who is above you. And, to approach God, he says, requires, he's going to get to the opposite of pride, which of course is humility. To approach God requires a humble heart, requires humility. But then he, of course, we might say, especially in a church situation, he says that raises a terrible question. How is it that people who are quite obviously eaten up with pride can say they believe in God and appear to themselves very religious? I'm afraid it means they are worshiping an imaginary God. They theoretically admit themselves to be nothing in the presence of this phantom God, but are really all the time imagining how he approves of them and thinks them far better than ordinary people. That is, they pay a penny worth of imaginary humility to him and get out of it a pound's worth of pride towards their fellow men. I suppose it was those people Christ was thinking of when he said some would preach about him and cast out devils in his name, only to be told at the end of the day that they'd never known him, that he had never known them. And any of us may at any moment be in this death trap. Luckily, we have a test. Whenever we find that our religious life is making us feel that we are good, above all, that we are better than someone else, I think we may be sure that we are being acted on not by God, but by the devil. The real test of being in the presence of God is that you either forget all about yourself altogether or see yourself as a small, dirty object. It's better to forget about yourself altogether. And that's, sometimes that's kind of a tough pill to swallow because we don't, and you realize what is the most well-known Christian hymn of all time? Amazing Grace, right? Amazing Grace. At least for the last, probably century at least. Amazing Grace. What is the first line of Amazing Grace? Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound that saved what? A wretch. A wretch like me. A wretch like me. Do you know that wasn't his original language there? It was changed. The original line was, Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound that saved a worm like me. And it was changed from worm to wretch. And we go, I'm not a worm. But what the hymn was trying to say is what he's trying to say here, that we cannot approach God and say, God, aren't you so excited to have me? Aren't you lucky that I follow you? Don't you feel so fortunate that I've chosen to worship you? You can't come into God with a sort of, hey, buddy, it's you and me. You have to come in realizing He is God and we're not. And we are, everything we have, everything we do is dependent on Him. Now, and He's going to correct the idea that means you have to be a sniveling, the word worm and wretch probably in our modern minds conjure up somebody who's just I don't know, I say sniveling, somebody who's, walking around all hunched over or something. He's not saying that. He's just saying you have to realize that if you are all about power and control, and I'm better than everybody, then it's very hard to bring that attitude to a holy God who is responsible for your life, for your very existence. He says, it's a terrible thing that the worst of all the vices can smuggle itself into the very center of our religious life. You can see why. The other and less bad vices come from the devil working on us through our animal nature. But this doesn't come through our animal nature at all. It comes directly from hell. It's purely spiritual. Consequently, it's far more subtle and deadly. He says, for example, teachers often appeal to a boy's pride, or as they call it, his self-respect, to make him behave decently. Many a man has overcome cowardice or lust or ill temper by learning to think that they're beneath his dignity. In other words, his pride. The devil laughs. He's content to see you becoming chaste and brave and self-controlled, provided all the time he's setting you up the dictatorship of pride. Just as he would be quite content to see your chilblains cured if he was allowed in return to give you cancer. Pride is spiritual cancer. It eats up the very possibility of love or contentment or even common sense. So is he using strong enough language here to tell us how pride is deadly? Now, at the end, of course, he mentions, we use that word pride in different ways. He's using it in a very specific way, this idea of a competitiveness that feels like I must be better than this person, and I'm so proud and so happy that I am better than you. That I'm smarter than you, I'm better looking than you, I'm richer than you, I'm more powerful than you, I'm more popular than you, I am above you. That's the kind of pride he's talking about. I am above you. He's not talking about some of the other ways we use the word pride. For example, on 125, he says, pleasure in being praised is not pride. Pleasure in being praised is not pride. It says, the child who's patted on the back for doing a lesson well, the woman whose beauty is praised by her lover, the saved soul to whom Christ says, well done, are pleased and ought to be. It says, but here the pleasure lies not in what you are, but in the fact that you have pleased someone you wanted and rightly wanted to please. So he says, if somebody, says, "Oh, that was a good job, thank you, you did that well." He says there's nothing wrong with taking pleasure in a compliment. Just like a child, you say, to a child, "Good job," or "Well done." He says there's nothing. That's not what he's talking about. He says the trouble is when you pass from thinking, "I've pleased him, all is well," to thinking, "What a fine person I must be to have done it." It's going from a pleasure to, "Man, I am hot stuff and so much better than anyone else who's ever done it." The more you delight in yourself and the less you delight in the praise, the worse you become. And even says, and this kind of pride, desiring praise, he says, is probably the most pardonable kind of praise, the least deadly kind. He says the vain person wants praise, applause, admiration too much and is always angling for it. It's a fault, but a childlike and even in an odd way, a humble fault. So he's saying the person who just wants lots of applause and lots of praise, yes, that's not good, but it's a pretty mild form. But he says it's humble because it shows you're not yet completely contented with your own admiration. You value other people enough to want them to look at you. You're in fact human. But then he says the real black diabolical pride comes when you look down on others so much you don't care what they think of you. Of course, it's very right and often our duty not to care what people think if we do so for the right reason, namely because we care so incomparably more what God thinks. But the proud man has a different reason for not caring. He says, "Why should I care for the applause of that rabble, as if their opinion were worth anything? Even if their opinions were of value. Am I the sort of person to blush with pleasure at the compliment like some chit of a girl at her first dance? No, I'm an integrated adult personality. All I've done has been done to satisfy my own ideals or my artistic conscience or the traditions of my family or in the world because I'm that kind of chap. If the mob likes it, let them. They're nothing to me." I mean, very British way of saying that, of course. But, he says, if you crave applause and praise, yeah, it's not great, but that's a pretty mild human trait. He calls that more vanity than pride. And he also says, so enjoying, someone telling you, "Good job, I like that, well done," that's not what he's talking about. He's also not talking, he says, about being proud of your son, your father, your school, your regiment, whatever, in other words. I'm proud to be a Sooner. I'm proud to be an Oklahoman. I'm proud, to be a Broken Arrow, or whatever. I'm proud of my son. I'm proud of my daughters. I'm proud of my grandkids. Again, that's not what he's talking about. He says, in that sense, pride is a warm-hearted admiration. That's not sinful. He says that's not what he's talking about. But again, if you begin to look down your nose at other people because of it, or he says, as long as that thing, whatever it is, your school, your family, doesn't take the place of God, he says, to love and admire, there at the bottom of the number 2 thing, to love and admire anything outside yourself is to take one step away from utter spiritual ruin. Though we shall not be well as long as we love and admire something more than we love and admire God. So, again, you got to be careful, even with patriotism. I do pledge allegiance to the flag. I'm proud to be an American, but it is secondary to my allegiance to God. God always trumps any national pride, any school pride, any other kind of pride of being a part of something. God always trumps any other kind of allegiance. And then he says, why, if you think pride is something that is because God is somehow, demanding his dignity, he says, God's not worried in the least about that. God's not worried about that. He says, why is this pride thing why does it get in the way so badly? Why is it such a cause of sin? About 3/4 of the way down on 127. The point is, he meaning God, he wants you to know him, wants to give you himself. And he and you are two things of such a kind that if you really get into any kind of touch with him, you will in fact be humble, delightedly humble, feeling the infinite relief of having for once got rid of all the silly nonsense about your own dignity, which has made you restless and unhappy all your life. He's trying to make you humble in order to make this moment possible, trying to take off a lot of silly, ugly, fancy dress in which we all have got ourselves up and are strutting about like the little idiots we are. I wish I'd got a bit further with humility myself. If I had, I could probably tell you more about the relief, the comfort of taking the fancy dress off, getting rid of the false self with all of its, look at me, and aren't I a good boy, and all its posing and posturing, to get even near it. And he's talking about this ability to come to God and cast off all that posturing and all that pride. He says to get even near it for a moment is like a drink of cold water to a man in a desert. Because God wants us to be humble so that we can actually have a relationship with him. Because you can't come to God as an equal. You're not. We're not. I'm not. We're not equal to God in any way, shape, or form. We have to come to him with humility. He made us. Everything we have, he made. Everything we have, he gave. Then the fourth sort of proviso, or the fourth correction, if you're picturing I have to be this snivelly, wormy person. He says, don't imagine that if you meet a really humble man, he will be what most people call humble nowadays. He won't be some sort of greasy, smarmy person who's always telling you that, of course, he's a nobody. He's telling us this is not, again, it's not, you're not supposed to be this little snivelly, worm-like person with their head down. Oh, I'm terrible. I'm awful. Oh, don't even look at me. I mean, he's not saying that at all. Probably all you will think about him if you meet a truly humble person is that he seemed a cheerful, intelligent chap who took a real interest in what you said to him. If you do dislike him, it will be because you feel a little envious of anyone who seems to enjoy life so much. He will not be thinking about humility. He will not be thinking about himself at all. So he says, if you meet a truly humble person, they'll probably be very happy, very cheerful, very smart, and very confident and not needing to show themselves better than somebody else, not needing to be competitive and have, the feeling of, that last paragraph, if anyone would like to acquire humility, I think, tell him the first step. The first step is to realize that one is proud. And a biggish step too. At least nothing whatever can be done before it. If you think you're not conceited, it means you are very conceited indeed. And that's about self-awareness, And I don't know of any profession or group that are not, this is not a trap for. My main experience is other clergy. And talk about competitive. Man, and myself, I'm guilty as well. I've seen it so much in others and in myself across the years of other clergy, oh, how big is your budget? Oh, yeah, mine's a little bigger than that. How many people did you have on Easter? Oh, we had this number of people. Oh, that's great. Yeah, we had about double that. Yeah, I mean, there is, I've seen it in clergy, including myself, a competitiveness, a sense of, I've got to have a bigger church and a bigger budget and a bigger this and a bigger that and a whatever. And in others and in myself. And I think it's probably not unique to clergy. It may be more dangerous in clergy than at some other places. But I can't think of any profession or any station of life where that sense of competitiveness and I've got to, this person who has, gotten first prize and I've gotten third prize, I have an instant sort of resentment there because they've beaten me. And there's just something human. He says it's a very human thing that we have to, it's a natural thing. Pride is something very human and natural that we have to find a way to become more humble. And especially when we approach God, we approach God with humility. So maybe enough about that. But that last sentence really hits you. If you think you're not conceited, yeah, you're probably really conceited. Which is like, wait a minute, how do I think of myself? Now, the next chapter is entitled Charity. And he mentions, I said in an earlier chapter, there were 4 cardinal virtues and 3 theological virtues. Can anybody name one of the 4 cardinal virtues? That was in a previous chapter. Anybody remember the 4 cardinal virtues that he mentions? Yeah, I had to double check myself. Okay, the 4 are, it's on page 76 if you want to go back and on this book, it's on 76 where he mentions the 4 cardinal virtues. Prudence, justice, temperance, and fortitude. Page 76, which is the chapter entitled The Cardinal Virtues. And at the bottom of page 76, if you have this version of the book, they are mentioned there. Prudence, temperance, justice, and fortitude. Those are the 4 cardinal virtues. And just as a recap, since he's going to be talking about the other 3 virtues, again, these words sometimes become words change their meaning so often or so much over time. Prudence is not one of those words that you hear hardly ever anymore. Prudence, the best, more modern way of talking about it would be common sense. Prudence is just common sense. To be prudent is just to use good judgment, to use common sense. Justice is pretty much, yes, justice is justice. We know what justice is. It is making things right, punishing evil and lifting up good. Temperance, boy, there's another word that hardly ever gets mentioned in modern, especially if you're kind of a student of American history, you know that there was something about 100 years ago called the temperance movement. And the temperance movement was anti-alcohol, and which led to eventually alcohol sales being banned in the United States of America. There was a period in which it was illegal to sell alcohol in this country, which led, of course, to bootleggers and organized crime and speakeasies and Al Capone and all kinds of other things. And then finally that amendment was repealed of prohibition. But the temperance movement was a movement was an anti-alcohol movement. It was often associated as a women's movement. Before there was the First Methodist women, before there was First or United Methodist women, before there was any of those predecessors, there was something called the WCTU, the Women's Christian Temperance Union. And it was dedicated to the eradication of alcohol. And if you look in history books, you'll see these women marching against alcohol with signs. These women, signs like "Lips that touch liquor shall never touch mine," and things like that. So the word temperance in American history takes that on. But temperance is really, again, just, not going overboard. Temperance really just means, don't doing anything to excess. Don't do things to excess. So, drunkenness would be against temperance, but almost anything that you do to excess would be against temperance. Temperance is not overdoing something. So prudence is good judgment, justice is justice, temperance is not overdoing things, and fortitude is basically courage. Okay, so those words have morphed over the years. So anyway, those are the first four. So back to 129, back to the chapter on charity. And the word charity has also changed its meaning. Because if you read a King James translation of the Bible, which I always say, the King James translation is beautiful language. I mean, it's from the same period of time as Shakespeare. The King James translation of the Bible is some of the most beautiful English ever written in that period of time, the early 1600s. King James Bible was published in 1603, I think, 1603, 1604, somewhere in there, or first decade of the 1600s. So it's over 400 years old, and people don't talk the way they talked 400 plus years ago. And if you read 1 Corinthians 13, which we know as the love chapter, love is patient, love is kind. That's right. If you read the King James, charity is patient, charity is kind, charity does not demand its own way. The word agape, which we almost always now translate love, in the King James is translated as the English word charity. So at the end of that chapter, it says these three things remain: faith, hope, and charity. Because the word agape, to dive deep, the word agape in Greek is translated in Latin as caritas, and that's where we get our word charity. And so the word charity is the same word that we would say as love. So he's going to make that. But of course, now when we hear the word charity, we don't think of it just as a word for love. We think of it as what? Yeah. Well, we think of it as giving money to some sort of organization that helps people who are less fortunate, a charitable cause. We think of, the Salvation Army or that's what we think of when we hear the word charity. But because the word has changed over 400 years. I mean, slight detour for a second, because there are churches in Broken Arrow and all over this country. There are churches in Broken Arrow and all over this country where the only Bible that is preached from or read is the King James translation. There are churches where that's the only Bible that is used, full of these and thous and thines, and all of that, And I say it's beautiful. It's just like Shakespeare is beautiful, but it's not the way people talk anymore. And if I remember getting into a debate, discussion, whatever, confrontation one time. Janine and I were at 71st and Mingo at the Mardell's Hobby Lobby there. Okay. And there, if you know where I'm talking about, right? Okay. On that corner, at least this was years ago, on that corner, across from Mardell's and Hobby Lobby was, maybe still is, a liquor store. And there were some people from a church who were protesting. They were in the Hobby Lobby parking lot, but they were protesting the liquor store across the street and saying some pretty horrible things about anybody who would patronize that store or anybody who would, and anybody who, and me being just me, I probably wouldn't do this today. I went up to those guys. I said, guys, I don't think you're helping here. You're not helping the cause. I said, I'm a pastor. I said, I don't drink alcohol. I said, but remember, Jesus drank. He drank wine. Jesus made wine. Jesus made wine at a wedding in Cana. So, yes, drunkenness is forbidden in the Bible, but Jesus himself drank wine, So, you're saying anybody who drinks any alcohol is sinning. I said, you're not helping here. You're not really helping the cause. And they said, Jesus didn't make wine. I was like, yeah? Yeah, well, no, he made grape juice. And I said, well, really, 2,000 years ago, there was not a way to keep the grape juice from fermenting. I said, there wasn't a way to keep the grape juice from fermenting back in those days. It would naturally become wine. And I said, the word in Greek there in the story of the wedding at Cana is winos. And I said, that's the Greek word for wine, And he said, I bet you went to seminary. I was like, yeah? And learned Greek. And I was like, yeah? And he says, well, the King James Bible is more authoritative than the Greek. And I said, huh? What? At their church, they were taught that the King James translation of the Bible was more authoritative than the original manuscripts of Hebrew and Greek. And I'm like, what? And they said, yes, God, did a special miracle. The translation of the King James translation was a miracle of God, and therefore it is the most authoritative Bible, more so than the original languages. The King James is the only authoritative version of the Bible. I was like, is that what your preacher preaches? He's like, yes. And I was like, well, he's not right. and to them, and then, Janine was like, why do you do that? Why do you waste your time, arguing with people like that, and you could tell when they said, I bet you went to seminary, like, they would say, I bet you went to, fill in the evil place, because education is obviously a dangerous thing. But all that to say, you will find there are churches that they do not allow you to use any other translation except the King James translation. They believe at least some part of what those people believed. And that's a little detour there, but reminding us that, because the King James will say in 1 Corinthians 13, it'll say charity, charity is not vain. Charity does not demand its own way. Charity is kind. Charity. It's the Greek word agape, and the best way to translate it is selfless love, because I've mentioned before, Greek has more words for love than English does. And agape is a particular kind of love, godly love, selfless love. Anyway, all that to say, he says here, this chapter on charity, he said in the second paragraph, first, to the meaning of the word, charity now means simply what used to be called alms. That is, giving to the poor. Originally, it had a much wider meaning. And you can see how it got it in the modern sense. If a man has charity, giving to the poor is one of the most obvious things he does. And so people came to talk as if that were the whole of charity. In the same way, rhyme is the most obvious thing about poetry. And so people came to mean by poetry simply rhyme. Charity means love in the Christian sense. But, and I've said this, dozens of times here and everywhere else, in the Christian sense, love does not mean an emotion. It is a state not of the feelings, but of the will. That state of the will which we have naturally about ourselves and must learn to have about other people. agape, love in the sense that Paul talks about it, in the sense that Jesus talks about it in the Bible, that love is not a squishy Valentine's Day feeling. It is a choice. It is a matter of the will. It is how you treat somebody. It has very little to do with whether you like them. It is in a biblical sense, you can love people that you don't like. Matter of fact, you are called to love people that you don't like. He says there at the bottom of page 29, I pointed out in the chapter on forgiveness that our love for ourselves doesn't mean we like ourselves. It means that we wish our own good. In the same way, Christian love, or caritas, charity, for our neighbors is quite a different thing from liking or affection. We like or are fond of some people and not of others. It's important to understand that this natural liking is neither a sin nor a virtue, any more than your like and dislikes in food are a sin or a virtue. It's just a fact. But of course, what we do about it is either sinful or virtuous. So whether you like a person is just a personal preference. Just like, I like cheeseburgers, but I don't like shrimp. I mean, it's just something you like. And, some people you naturally are drawn to. You share interest, you share whatever. Some people you don't. And as he says, whether you like somebody is totally a matter of really an emotional connection. Love, when Jesus says love your enemies, that has nothing to do with whether you like them. Matter of fact, you're not going to like your enemies. It's about how you treat them. Now it says natural liking or affection for people makes it easier to be charitable towards them. It's therefore normally the duty to encourage our affections to like people as much as we can, just as it's often our duty to encourage our liking for exercise or wholesome food, or we might say healthy food. Not because this liking is itself the virtue of charity, because it is a help to it. On the other hand, it's also necessary to keep a very sharp lookout for fear our liking for some one person makes us uncharitable or even unfair to someone. There are even cases where our liking conflicts with our charity towards the person we like. For example, a doting mother may be tempted by natural affection to spoil her child. That is, to gratify her own affectionate impulses at the expense of the child's real happiness later on. And we've probably all seen examples of that. When, mom and dad or grandma and grandpa or whoever like their precious little darling so much that they cannot ever tell him or her no, which is ultimately not loving them. If you never tell a child no, you are not loving them because you like them too much. If you like them so much that you don't love them appropriately. And luckily, my wife has taught me that lesson quite a bit about because she is the one who has the child development degree and knows a lot more about it than I do. We can sometimes, we like somebody so much we actually do the unloving thing, especially if it's somebody in our family. And he just, he basically says you can't, and he goes on to say, and I've said this because it's not original to me, you can't just manufacture feelings, That's why Jesus, when he says love your enemy, he's not commanding you to have a warm feeling about them, because you can't command anybody, not even Jesus can command you how to feel. I can't say, feel happy, feel sad, feel excited, feel guilty. I mean, you can't tell somebody else how to feel. We can tell them, but you can't. It's not going to work. So, all the talk about love is only about how you treat people. But then he says, if you act as if you like somebody, it will probably kind of grow on you. The more you act as if you like a person, the more you might naturally actually come to like them. So, you'll come, that often happens. If you treat somebody as if you like them, you may eventually kind of like them. But then he says there's an exception. if you do him, this person that you don't like, and you do something kind for him, if you do him a good turn, not to please God and obey the law of charity, but to show him what a fine, forgiving chap you are, and to put him in your debt, and this sound to wait for his gratitude, you'll probably be disappointed. In other words, if it all becomes again about ego and pride and all that, if you're like, now, show me your gratitude, show me how wonderful I am for treating you so nice. If you're looking for that, you're probably going to be disappointed. Excuse me. Let me grab a drink real quick. So, charity is really what we would call love. He's writing some of this is in the middle of a war, and he talks about, remember in the war, he first gave these addresses in the middle of World War II, bottom of 131. The same spiritual law works terribly in the opposite direction. If you like somebody, or if you treat somebody as if you like them, you will probably actually grow to like them more. He says that works terribly in the opposite direction. The Germans, perhaps, at first ill-treated the Jews because they hated them. Afterwards, they hated them much more because they had ill-treated them. The more cruel you are, the more you will hate. And the more you hate, the more cruel you will become. It is, and so on, in a vicious circle forever. So, if you treat someone poorly, you will come to dislike them even more, and the more you dislike them, the more cruel you'll be, and on and on and on. That it works the opposite of treating somebody that you don't really like that well, treating them as if you like them. You may actually come to like them. Let me take this mic away from my mouth. Excuse me. I don't want to cough into that mic. And then what about, it says some writers, they're in the middle of 132, some writers use the word charity to describe not only Christian love between human beings, but also God's love for man and man's love for God. About the second of these two, people are often worried. They're told they ought to love God, and they can't find any such feelings in themselves. What are they to do? The answer is the same as before. Act as if you did. Do not sit trying to manufacture feelings. Ask yourself, if I were sure that I love God, what would I do? When you found the answer, go do it. On the whole, God's love for us is a much safer subject to think about than our love for him. Nobody can always have devout feelings. Even if we could, feelings are not what God principally cares about. Christian love, either towards God or towards man, is an affair of the will. If we're trying to do his will, we are obeying the commandment, thou shalt love the Lord thy God. He will give us feelings of love if he pleases. We cannot create them for ourselves. We must not demand them as a right. But the great thing to remember is that though our feelings come and go, his love for us does not. It is not wearied by our sins or our indifference, and therefore it is quite relentless in its determination that we shall be cured of those sins at whatever cost to us, at whatever cost to him. That's why I always say, when somebody is angry at God, you don't have to shield those feelings. And if you're angry at God, just like, all of us at some time or another got angry at our parents. We may have even, at some point in adolescence, some people say to mom and dad, I hate you, or, I never want to see you, or get out of my life, or I can't wait to leave the house, or, all kinds of things, And, the parable of the prodigal son is exactly that. The kid who leaves his father says, I can't wait for you to die, Dad. Can I have your inheritance now? Horribly disrespectful thing to say to your father. And yet the father never stops loving that son. His love is constant. So when we get mad at God, and sometimes that is the natural, again, you can't control your emotions. If you feel anger, Not like, oh, I can't be mad. Oh, that's not right. I can't be mad at God. Yeah, you can. And he can, what you need to do if you are upset with God about something, you need to talk to God about it. Not bottle it up or hold it down or be afraid or think, oh, those are thoughts I can't have. I mean, if you're angry at God, talk to God about it. You know, I have not heard. I only heard a snippet of it, but you know, a lot of people, myself included, you know, in the morning, often I see the first 10 minutes of the Today Show, and so when Savannah Guthrie's mother was kidnapped, and she still doesn't know. She doesn't know where she is, if she's dead or alive. You know, it's been like 2 months now. But she went back to work this week and went back to the Today Show. But before that, on Easter Sunday, she spoke at her church, you know, and she admitted in that when she was talking in her church, she was disappointed in God. She didn't stop loving him. She didn't stop worshiping him. But she shared her feelings, you know, about what has this done with her faith and how she's dealt with God in all of this. And, you know, she was just speaking the truth. You know, she said, I still believe, I still love him, I still follow him. But she admitted in the middle of that, God had not always done what she was wanting God to do. And I think that is healthy and right. That if you're upset with God, then you need to talk to God. Not stew about it, not, push it down. And there's examples in the Bible of that. If you look at the Old Testament especially, I mean, they get God and Moses go at each other all the time, Basically Moses is like, this is not a direct quote from the Old Testament, but he's basically like, you put me out here with these impossible people, you call me to deal with these people and they're stubborn and they're, he's just complaining to God about these people that he's stuck him with, and Abraham gets angry at God, when God says, I'm going to bless you with this big family, and Abraham's like, how are you going to do that? I'm an old man. I don't have any kids. What are you talking about? I mean, he gets mad at God. I mean, there are many examples of the Old Testament heroes who talk back to God pretty bluntly, and God doesn't seem to be upset by it, because God is tough, and God loves us like a father, like a mother, and so God's love is constant, even if ours isn't. God never stops loving us. He doesn't wax and wane like we do. So. Let me see what time it really is, because the silly clock in the back is always a little bit wrong. Got about 3 minutes left, so I probably better, before we tackle the next chapter, we're going to talk about hope. And if you read ahead, hope, talking about faith, hope, love. Hope is important, and we'll pick up with hope. But based on anything you read this week, or now it's coming back, it's coming back into your mind, the last where we were before, and now thinking about these two chapters on pride and then on charity, aka agape love. Thoughts, questions, insights, frustrations. Remember, if you think you don't have any pride, you probably. Mm-hmm.
I knew she was in heaven. That was me. But I took care of her physically. I saw that she had her medication and exercise and physical. And so I know she was in heaven. That didn't answer my question. How are you taking care of her?
Right.
I probably was months later before I got an answer. And it came one night. It was, she's with those who love her and those who she loves.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, that's not me. So I was like, why?
Mm-hmm.
You know, I did. I got really, I wasn't, I stopped believing it. I was mad at him because she was now in his care. And I wanted to know, what are you doing to her?
You're right. Because I think I know a little better than you. I think I know her better than you know her, God. Yeah, right? Yeah. Right. Yeah.
So, you know, but that, his answers did satisfy me.
Mm-hmm.
Realized that she was, you know, she was with people she loved and those who loved her.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think it's, if we are human and a relationship, if you have a lifelong relationship with God, there are going to be moments where you feel disappointed or angry or questioning and I just do think the important thing is that that's not the time to walk away from a relationship. That's a way to engage truthfully and tell him how you're feeling. And he's tough enough to take. I tell that to youth all the time, when I was a youth director and when I do camp. God is tough. God has a thick skin. You don't have to be afraid of hurting God's feelings. Oh, they're mad at me. Oh no, God is tough, and God can handle it, and God can even if we're upset with him, he's big enough to hear it, and it doesn't mean that he stops loving us, and it usually doesn't mean we stop loving him. It just
Stays the same regardless of my feelings.
yeah. He is there, and he is wanting us to continue the relationship, even if it's a little testy, or even if we don't understand something. I the summer before I went to seminary, I had dated one girl in college for 3 years, and we broke up. She broke up with me as I was headed off to seminary, and so I got to seminary. Didn't know a soul in California. I took Greek the first, concentrated Greek the first semester. Every morning for 4 hours, Greek every morning for every day of the week. And I remember one night going, God, what are you doing? I'm out here. I don't know anybody. I'm out here in California. My girlfriend of 3 years broke up with me. I don't know anybody out here. I wasn't mad as much as I was. What, is this? Are you sure this is what I'm supposed to be doing? And it was a few months later I met Janine, and things started to make more sense. But sometimes we go to God. This doesn't make sense. What's going on? And we need to vent, and we need to talk to God about it. So. Anyway, hope. I hope you read the chapter on hope, and we'll try to cover at least 2 more chapters next time. And we got four more weeks to get through the last part of the book, which I think we can do, and because our pace is right about right where we are. So let's pray. Lord, thanks for who you are and what you do, and Lord, thank you for understanding that we are flawed, and help us to realize we're flawed and that we are human, and that sometimes pride gets the better of us. Lord, as we seek to be more mindful of who we are compared to you, compared to one another, give us humility, give us love, give us forgiveness. Help us to have that peace that comes from knowing that our worth is because we're made in your image, and because you love us, and because we're your children. And Lord, that is a magnificent thing. Lord, so be with us all through this next week and through this springtime. We thank you for the joys of Easter, and we ask you to bless us now. Amen.